Hi guys, it's Benny here with LekkerTV again. Normally it's a light-hearted conversation, but today we've got a most important episode that I'm ever going to do as mine and Rob's grandparents recovered at Lake Windermere together after the Holocaust. So we want to carry on that legacy and pass on the message to young people today. How are you doing today, Rob?
I'm fine, Benny. How are you?
Okay, Rob. So, as I mentioned before, our grandfathers did recover at Lake Windermere together after the Holocaust, and we know that this is such an important matter for us. So, just to start us off, could you tell us how your grandfather's experiences impacted you as you were growing up? As for my grandfather, he was always telling me stories, and I've carried that with me all through my youth.
Hmm. Well, Benny, it shapes everything, doesn't it? It colors pretty much how you see the world, and especially you see two things: how you evaluate, and I might use the language judge, but I think it's a better way of describing it. A better way to describe it is how you share in the world that we collectively inhabit with other people. So, in both of our grandparents' case, they'd come through unspeakable horror. They were orphaned. They'd known what it was to live as slaves, and they'd survived and were in many respects reborn into this country, having been through the darkness into the light of the Lake District and to England. And there were two lessons, I think, above all else, that they were gifted, which then they passed on to both of us. Firstly, the gift of really appreciating, loving even, what Britain at its best could be and is. And that's a sense of inclusivity, of democracy under the rule of law. And so, what they knew, because they'd touched the face of tyranny, they knew what it was not to have freedom. They knew where the death of democracy could lead, is that they reminded us both, I think, through the stories they told, that freedom of speech really mattered, that living in a nation of laws where people were judged fundamentally and critically, not by virtue of who they were, but what they did is absolutely everything. And I think that's the most important and enduring message that certainly my grandfather left me. And it's one for absolutely everybody. You know, Benny, you're making this TV show, and you can only do that because you're free to say what you want, right?
Exactly. Just to echo what you said there, I feel that with my granddad growing up, he'd do little things that I'd notice, such as we got went to a restaurant, you get food in the restaurant. It can be standard to send food back. My granddad, whenever anyone in my family sent something back, he would just chuckle and not say anything and just shake his head with a smile. And I think that encompasses perfectly his attitude, as what you said, to sort of being in a free world, but also keeping his past in mind and bringing that with him. So I think that's
There's
very
also a
powerful.
really important sense memory of knowing what it is to be hungry. And we use those words: I'm cold, I'm hungry. Sense your words.
Mm.
Some of your watchers, your viewers, you'll know I made a documentary in Poland on the earth where your grandfather stood as well, almost certainly. And it was in the middle of winter, and you'd have done anything to stop the cold. There we were with food. And as you stood and you thought about your grandfather and mine and countless others standing there in rags in winter, hungry. They had a true sense of what it meant to be hungry, to be without food, to starve. And, your grandfather's relationship with food is one that's really shared amongst all the survivors. They delight and appreciate. And above all else, in my grandfather's case, they were constantly present with food. It mattered to
Yes,
them,
yes, it did.
both in the sharing of joy and because they knew what it was to not have food. When my grandfather died, although he was fairly comfortable, dotted about the place in the backs of wardrobes and in drawers were little handkerchiefs with food in. Um, and that's a terrifying and terrible story, because even though you know that food is easily obtainable, you never lose the trauma of knowing what it was to starve.
Now I'm here with Rob's mum, Angie Cohen. who has been an angel to me.
Hi, Benny.
Yes, you've been an angel to me, a complete angel. And she is the head of the 45 Aid Society, which consists of Holocaust survivors in the UK. Angie, can you tell us a bit more about your work, please, and what you do and why it's so important?
Sure, I can. Let me give you a bit more background about the 45A Society. After the war, 732 young survivors, which included 180 girls, came to the UK. So they came here, most of them having lost their entire families in the Holocaust. My dad, your grandpa, my dad came from Poland as an example of one of the boys. They became known as the boys, even though there were 180 girls.
People aren't as close to the Holocaust as you and I. They've not got a family member. In fact, the majority of the UK will not. So I've really taken the responsibility, as of you, to sort of spread the message of the Holocaust. So, how can the lessons of the Holocaust relate to a young person who's not as close to it as you and I? How can they take the lessons today?
Well, first of all, there's this word that's going around, and it's a really good one. I'm excited by it, not fearful of it, which is to educate yourself. And it's part of the enduring mission of being alive. It's what makes getting up in the morning worthwhile is to educate yourself. The lessons of the Shoah are so important. You hear that word Shoah, the Holocaust, and they're more important now than ever. And there are books and films you can watch to be sure. But just in a nutshell, to know that 6 million men, women, and children, some of them babies, Jewish people, disabled people, people who were LGBTQ, these outsiders, were murdered. And they weren't murdered in some explosion of violence. This didn't start in some backwater somewhere. It's not something that any one of you watching this can ignore, because you see, it applies to each and every one of us. This all started in a country, in a place not dissimilar from our own, an advanced democracy like ours, where everybody felt that they were living in a really advanced, a really evolved, a really, in some cases, cool part of history, where there was, it seemed, democracy, there were parties, great architecture, and then within the blink of an eye, all it took was a leader to come along and for there to be really bad economic circumstances. And think about that today. And for people to feel aggrieved by a treaty. And that leader that I was talking about to find a way of galvanizing or getting all the rest of the population together to point at individuals to blame. And from that point and that moment onwards, through a slow process of propaganda, through persuading people that those were the reasons, that those people were the reasons for your lot in life, and then changing the laws, and then persuading others to stand by and do nothing, whilst those 6 million men, women, and children were taken to their deaths. You realize just how easy it is for history to repeat itself. And so the lessons for today and why it's so important for everybody to know about this is because unless we remember the lessons of the past, we're bound to repeat them. And we're bound to repeat them even in our own countries. And it's more than ever now the responsibility of not just you and me, but our viewers to learn one of the stories, to become a witness, and then to go on to become an advocate. Because, you can't be courageous. You can't practice any of the virtues consistently, as Maya Angelou said, without being courageous, without having courage. And courage every day requires you to know about the Holocaust so that you can take the lessons into the world and change the world for the better.
Definitely. 100%. And it is so true about the courage, what you've just said, because you have to face these terrible facts of history in order to educate yourself. And then with that education, you can then take it into your future life and speak out when you see any sort of persecution or anything heading in that direction. I think that education is the vital cornerstone
Right.
of preventing that in the future, for sure. The 45A Society, it's now become a generational organisation, which I think is amazing, because now I feel like I'm part of it, even as a third generation, and there'll be other fourth generations.
You
And,
are.
and I think that's,
You are, Bennett.
yeah, and I think that's testament to you, because for an organisation to become generational and involve family members that weren't alive at the time of all the terrible things that happened, I think it's so important, and that's why I'm so grateful for your work, and also Rob's on TV, but especially yours, for leading the society and keeping us all involved, and I think that's so important today.
It is important, and it's not just me. There's, as you know, there's an amazing team. But the thing that is so important, Benny, and I can't stress this enough, you know, whether it's racism, whether it's bullying, whether it's homophobia, we know, unfortunately, the stories are as relevant today as they were then, and that's what we've got to push. You know, I will tell you the story of my father's family, and you can tell me the story of your grandfather's family, but we've got to understand it can happen again.
Exactly. I think the foundation of the work is definitely education for those that aren't as familiar with it. I think, because
Absolutely.
I think that the educational foundation, once it's laid, and people not only see the facts and the figures, and they see old videos, but I feel with the 45A Society, when you get first or even second hand accounts of someone like you whose father went through it, I think that's so important for them to become closer to something that they won't always be as close with.
Obviously, you know, when I did Rob's program, and I ended up in Treblinka, where I'd never been before, and you realise that it was my family, and I'd never been there before, and it was like the ghosts came out the ground, and these weren't just ghosts, these were my family, you know, little girls with blonde hair and pink cheeks, and a little boy and a mum and dad, real people. And that's the story of the Holocaust, and the fact that people can look at one another and just hate one another goes back to racism, goes back to homophobia, goes back to bullying, and it's not good. It's not good.
So the story of the Holocaust is the story of not just Jews, not just minorities, it's the story of humanity. And exactly as you describe, it's that moment about when it's your turn to have the courage to stand up when you see any form of prejudice, bullying, whatever kind, that ultimately you're imbued with a memory, an understanding, a truth of where that can lead.
Definitely. So, taking what you've just said and your whole experience, you did do your program, Who Do You Think You Are, and the more recent one, when you went back and visited the more less discussed areas of sort of the Holocaust and the persecution. Through your whole journey, what has been your ultimate lesson? Because for me, my granddad, I've carried his thoughts, which are persecution should always be spoken out about, because it took survivors a while to get it out, get all the stories out there, but they did eventually, and they know how hard it is to carry that burden. So I am carrying that on, and anytime I see anyone in need or persecution, you need to make others aware of it, and it is a responsibility as a member of the human race. So that, I feel, is my main lesson, which relates also back to what you said, educating, when other people educate themselves and use it to prevent things like this happening in the future. But what is your ultimate lesson, if you could just sum that up, please?
I think you've said it perfectly. My ultimate lesson is that you know, we are, all of us, an interconnected family. the human race. And the human race is fragile and it's flawed. And for us to survive on this small planet, our job, our mission, our sacred birthright is to have the courage to stand up against hatred, to stand up against prejudice, always to have courage, never to be a bystander, but to remember what happened in the Holocaust is not the story of just a small group of people, it's our story. And consequently, always to remind yourself what your duty is as a person. Be brave enough to stand up for what's right and to be a witness of truth.
I think in terms of visiting a concentration camp, it's like that, but so much more magnified because of, you know, what happened there and we know the stories, but you can relate because people from our bloodline were there. And that, for those who aren't as close to the Holocaust, I think it's important that they realise that it's just a place of such unhappy memories and terrible. But I also see glimmers of hope whenever I watch programmes that you made with Rob, or when I speak to you about your grandfather, because we're also honoured any relation to these survivors to be connected to them. And even through all that horror and the darkness, I think the glimmers of hope are personified in us. I think so. And
and you know, every year we have a reunion where the boys now come, but they come with their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. And you're absolutely right, but Benny, we celebrate the boys' lives, you know, because when they came to this country and they were accepted by this country, and they gave back to the country, they absolutely celebrated being part of the United Kingdom and whatever country took them in. And there's a joy there. There's an absolute joy that they brought families into the world. And people like you, Benny, you know, you're doing if your grandfather's sitting on your shoulder, and lots of time my dad is sitting on my shoulder, and you just feel that somewhere or another they're quite proud of us. And that's an incredible feeling.
I think so. Look, that's what I really want to get across to people as well, as even though we can revisit the haunting past, and you go, and like you said, you saw the ghosts come up out of the floor when you were there, of your family. Even through that experience, there's such a contrast with the tales of after the war, and how valued we became to our family, because I know with so many survivors, their kids and their grandkids just mean absolutely so much to them, even more so than the average person, because of what they started out with and the experiences, and then just afterwards how much more grateful you can become. And it's up to us to carry that on. And I think hopefully we're doing a good job, but it's always, you're right, it's always on my shoulder. Like I said, this is why I'm doing the interview, because not that many people have sort of that connection. And I think it's still so important, because of what is happening in the world still, to give a little bit of your dad and a bit of my granddad on our shoulders to everyone, I think. Definitely.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, exactly. So, what does it mean to you to be a second generation Holocaust survivor? But I feel like you've covered quite a bit of it, but if you could sum it up again, because I think it's very, very powerful.
My dad loved this country and one of the reasons was because of democracy. And because when I was a kid, this is well before your time, in Hyde Park, there was somewhere called Speaker's Corner.
I know it.
And in Speaker's Corner, you could, I don't know if you ever knew it, but there were boxes. You literally stood on a box and you could say whatever you wanted, whether you love the royal family, whether you didn't love the royal family, whether you love the government, whether you didn't like the government. And when I was a little girl, people screaming and shouting, I was quite scared. But for my dad to be able to say what you want and live in a country where you are free to say what you want, and we have democracy and we have the rule of law, I never, ever, ever take that for granted. And that's what perhaps my dad has given me.
Exactly. I think they have given us such a different perspective on even the smaller things that people living in a Western free country would take somewhat for granted. Not everyone does, but some people do, because it's become so normalized for a lot of people.
Absolutely
Yeah,
right. No, I totally get that. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. But if the one aspect of what I'm talking to is so people can hear stories like this and be grateful for the free speech and the democracy, and see that was a treat for your dad.
Absolutely,
Exactly, I think that,
absolutely. As you say, you do take it for granted a bit. I don't, because of my dad. I don't, because of my dad.
yeah.
And a sense of fairness.
Mm.
That is key always. And people being kind. I think people should be kind. And perhaps that's what my dad taught me as well.
Yeah. I think from this conversation, I think one lesson has stood out to me particularly, and that is having the courage to educate and speak out and all those things. And you're right, it does take a certain bravery to face these horrible pasts, and hopefully people watching will be inspired and become courageous and educate themselves and face the past, because it is.
I don't want them to be courageous. I want them I want them to be more than courageous, Benny. I want them to be courageous witnesses. You know, once you've heard a story like your grandfather, and you sit down and tell a friend your grandfather's whole story, or mine, you can't put it away. It's not something that you can sort of put back on the Netflix list. You then become a witness, and as a lawyer, that's really important. You become a witness of truth, which means that when you hear anti-Jewish racism, when people talk about what's going on in the world, even today, for example, with the Uyghur Muslims in China, you're instantly sent back to that story, and you're instantly reminded, I want to tell you the story of Benny's grandfather or Rob's grandfather and what happened. And once you become a witness, you're then morally obliged, you're bound, you're forced, you've got no choice but then to speak up and become an advocate. And that's what I want people who watch your program to remember.
Amazing. No, amazing. Look, I'm with you every step of the way, because we're so close to it, and it's about translating that message across to people that aren't as close to it as us. But I'm with you 100%, because it does mean so much to us, and the lessons are so valuable, and they are transferable, and they can be taken by other people to make them better and also make a better future. Definitely. Angie, my last question, I asked Rob this. What's the ultimate lesson a young person can take from the horrors of the Holocaust and my grandfather's and your father's stories of survival and then happier memories after the war? What can they take from that?
You have to be positive. You can't become a victim all your life, because that's one thing my dad wasn't. My dad was a survivor. Your granddad was a survivor. And they didn't hate. You must never hate. I said that before, and I can't stress that enough. And you become positive and teach the lessons, so at least you can give back and try and make sure it doesn't happen again. Perhaps that covers all last three questions as well. And I hope the message is positive, and you have to be positive in life, and you have to go forward and be kind and give back because you want people to be good.
Exactly.
Lots of cliches there,
No,
but it works.
and yeah, but Angie, those cliches again, can become somewhat of a novelty living in the Western world, and it's something that you might hear in your English lesson or your ethics lesson in school. But for my grandfather and your dad, those cliches are so applicable because they came.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so when people that are watching are using cliches, if you actually think about how much they can mean to someone, again, I think, wow, I think that's just a testament to your work for carrying it on, and Rob for putting it on the TV, and our relatives for championing them so much. But it's a deserved championship, definitely, 100%. Thanks so much, Rob. You've been great. This has been Lekker TV. It's been more of a serious one, but my most important, please take our word with weight, because it means so much to us, and it should do to you as well.
And thank you, Benny, for this as well.
My granddad's here with me.
My dad as
yeah,
well.
exactly. I would do anything for my family because of my granddad, and anyone watching, I really want them to take our attitude and speak up on persecution that's still going on, such
Absolutely.
as in China. Rob emphasized this, and I think it's so important to take our experiences and use them to better the lives of others. So everyone watching, please educate yourselves. I think you can see how happy me and Angie are talking about it, because it means so much to us, and I know it can be dark, but it's strange because there's just so many glimmers of light that I find in those stories.
Absolutely.
I know.
Absolutely.
All right.
Oh, thanks for this. Listen, you take care.
Angie, I'll so much love. This has been Lekker TV with Angie Cohen. Wow, and we're gonna put the 45 Aid Society's brand new website in the description down below. And I'd just like to mention Trevor Avery and dedicate this interview to his work. I'm gonna put his details in the description section of this video, because his work has been amazing, and me and Rob, I'm sure, are extremely grateful for what he's done. But
Certainly are. Lots of love.
and also, again, I'd like to give a special mention to Trevor Avery, who is in charge of the Windermere Holocaust exhibition. And wow, also a true angel, a true angel.
You be well. Take care.
Oh, Angie.